When did a student become a district-wide threat? I was grading in my classroom when I heard a bang and shouting from Mr. Hartman's room next door. Then I heard a door slam so hard the windows rattled and footsteps running down the hallway. 5 minutes later, the same door burst open again, and I heard glass shattering. Not just one window, but multiple crashes in rapid succession, like someone was systematically destroying everything made of glass. I jumped up and looked through my classroom door's window to see what was happening. That's when I saw Kane Foley wielding a crowbar. Kane was our valedictorian candidate who never caused trouble. He tutored other kids and volunteered at the animal shelter on weekends. But right now, he was swinging that crowbar like a man possessed, taking out every glass surface in Mr. Hartman's classroom. The safety glass was exploding into thousands of tiny cubes that sparkled on the floor. Mr. Hartman came running out of his room and straight into the library with Kane chasing after him. The teacher looked terrified as he dodged between the study tables trying to keep distance between himself and the crowbar. Kane was screaming things about years of torment and how he couldn't take it anymore. His face was red and twisted with rage I'd never seen before. I slammed my classroom door shut and told my students to get away from the windows and stay in their seats. Some kids were crying while others were filming through the door, despite my orders to sit down. We could hear the destruction continuing in the library as Kane went after everything breakable. The beautiful old oak shelving from the 1940s was splintering under his assault. The sound of sirens started filling the air from multiple directions. Our school sat right between two state highways, so response time was quick. I kept my students calm while counting the increasing wail of emergency vehicles. State police, local cops, and even K-9 units were converging on our school. The parking lot was turning into a sea of flashing lights. Through our window, we could see officers surrounding the building and setting up a perimeter. A voice on a megaphone was telling Kane to put down the weapon and come out peacefully. The response was more breaking glass and what sounded like furniture being overturned. Mr. Hartman had barricaded himself in the library's back office, while Kane destroyed everything in the main room. 90 minutes passed with my students trapped in their seats. Nobody could use the bathroom or leave for their next classes. Parents were starting to gather outside the police line and calling their kids' phones. I kept everyone calm by letting them text their families to say they were safe, but couldn't leave yet. The destruction sounds had stopped, but nobody knew if Kane still had the crowbar. A woman pushed through the police line and officers tried to stop her, but she kept going. Through the hallway window, I saw it was Kane's mother still in her hospital scrubs from work. She walked straight into that library like there wasn't an armed, angry teenager inside. The cops followed her with weapons drawn, looking confused and concerned. 10 minutes later, Kane's mom came out with the crowbar in one hand and her other arm around her son. He was sobbing and looked completely deflated, like all the rage had drained out of him. The police moved in immediately and pushed Kane onto a stretcher despite his mother's protests. They strapped him down tight while he kept apologizing to his mom. As they wheeled him past our classroom toward the ambulance, I heard one of the officers mention taking him to the Air Force Base hospital. Kane's dad was stationed there as some kind of high-ranking officer. The family lived on base in military housing, which meant this incident was about to become way more complicated than a simple school discipline issue. After the ambulances left, we were finally released from lockdown. My students filed out quietly past the destroyed library where maintenance staff were already sweeping up glass. The old oak shelves were reduced to splinters, and Mr. Hartman's desk looked like someone had taken a sledgehammer to it. Years of books and educational materials were ruined. Mr. Hartman emerged from his hiding spot looking shaken but unharmed. Other teachers were comforting him and asking what had triggered Kane's breakdown. He kept shaking his head, saying he'd just been giving the boy constructive criticism about his latest essay. Nobody was buying it because we'd all heard him through the walls for years. Principal Williams called an emergency staff meeting that afternoon. She explained that Kane was being held for psychiatric evaluation at the base hospital. His military family was cooperating fully with both civilian and military police investigations. She warned us not to discuss the incident with media or on social media while legal matters were pending. As we left the meeting, I overheard two senior teachers whispering in the hallway. They'd taught here for decades and remembered Kane's older brother who'd graduated 6 years ago. Apparently, he'd also been one of Mr. Hartman's favorite targets until he'd attempted something that got hushed up. The family had nearly sued the district, but settled quietly. I walked past Mr. Hartman's ruined classroom on my way out. He was standing in the doorway surveying the destruction with maintenance staff. When he saw me looking, he actually smirked and shook his head like this was all just a minor inconvenience. That's when I heard a janitor say, "Third one in 10 years, Hartman. The district's going to expose your secret teaching methods soon." The janitor looked around the empty hallway before stepping closer to Hartman. "You break them down piece by piece until they snap." He pulled out his phone and showed Hartman something on the screen. "I've got copies of every repair invoice from your classroom going back 10 years. The janitor tucked his phone away and walked off down the hall before Hartman could respond. I stood frozen in place watching this whole exchange from 20 feet away. Hartman turned back to his destroyed classroom and ran his hand along the damaged doorframe. That smirk was still on his face like he was proud of what happened. My stomach turned watching him survey the wreckage with such calm satisfaction. The maintenance crew kept sweeping glass while Hartman pointed out spots they'd missed. He actually chuckled when one worker held up a piece of his shattered teaching award. Something about his complete lack of concern made my skin crawl in a way I couldn't shake. I grabbed my bag and headed for the parking lot without looking back. The drive home felt longer than usual, with the janitor's words playing over in my head. 3 students in 10 years had violently snapped in Hartman's classroom. That couldn't be coincidence or bad luck with difficult kids. I kept hearing Kane's screams about years of torment echoing through the walls. The kid had been our top student before something in him finally broke. At home, I sat at my kitchen table staring at a blank notebook. My hands were shaking as I started writing down everything I could remember. The time Hartman made a girl cry during her presentation about her dead grandmother. The boy who transferred schools after Hartman spent months calling his essays worthless garbage. The endless stream of kids who went from confident to silent in his advanced classes. I wrote for 3 hours, filling page after page with memories I'd tried to ignore. Each incident seemed small on its own, but together, they painted an ugly picture. By midnight, I had 20 pages of documented patterns going back 5 years. My alarm went off at 6, and I dragged myself to the school feeling exhausted. The hallways were buzzing with whispers about Kane and what happened yesterday. Kids huddled in groups showing each other videos they'd taken during the lockdown. I noticed several students taking the long way around to avoid passing Hartman's classroom. The broken door was covered with plywood, but everyone knew what was behind it. Some kids actually crossed themselves when they had to walk past. During my first period class, the morning announcements came on with Principal Williams's voice. She talked about counselors being available and the importance of supporting each other. Not one word about investigating what caused a straight-A student to lose his mind. At lunch, I sat with my usual group in the teacher's lounge. I mentioned how traumatic yesterday must have been for the students who witnessed everything. Most teachers nodded and shared their own lockdown experiences from their classrooms. But 2 older teachers, Hannah Cook and another I didn't know well, exchanged a long look. Hannah started to say something, then stopped herself and went back to her salad. The other teacher just shook her head and muttered something about history repeating itself. I wanted to ask what she meant, but Principal Williams walked in right then. She reminded everyone about the staff meeting yesterday and confidentiality requirements. Her eyes swept the room like she was looking for troublemakers. My phone buzzed with an email notification while she was talking. The subject line read, "Urgent, maintaining educational continuity," from Principal Williams herself. I opened it to find 3 paragraphs about professional boundaries and not discussing ongoing investigations. The message was clear without saying it directly. Keep your mouth shut about Hartman. After school, I waited until most teachers had left before approaching the janitor near the supply closet. He was loading cleaning supplies onto his cart when he saw me coming. "We should talk about what you said to Hartman earlier." He glanced around nervously, then shook his head. "Not here. Too many ears in these walls." He thought for a moment, then suggested a coffee shop on Oak Street. "Tomorrow morning at 7 before anyone else is around." I agreed, and watched him hurry away with his cart rattling down the hall. Back home that evening, I looked up Christopher Fry's number from our union directory. He answered on the 3rd ring, sounding tired but alert when I explained why I was calling. "You're thinking about whistleblowing?" he asked after I gave him the basics. I told him I wasn't sure yet, but wanted to understand my options. He scheduled a meeting for Thursday and warned me to document everything carefully. Keep copies in multiple places and don't use school computers for anything. After hanging up, I opened my laptop and started creating a detailed log. I typed out yesterday's incident first with every detail I could remember. Then I worked backward through the years, adding dates and specifics when I had them. The pattern was so obvious when laid out chronologically. Hartman targeted the brightest students and slowly destroyed their confidence with his constructive criticism. By 2 in the morning, I had 30 pages of documentation saved in 3 different cloud services. The next morning, Principal Williams stood at the podium during announcements talking about moving forward positively. She announced extra counseling resources and reminded students about the importance of academic excellence. Behind her cheerful words was a desperate attempt to pretend nothing serious had happened. She never mentioned Kane's name or asked why our best student had snapped. The whole speech felt like watching someone sweep dirt under a rug. Teachers around me nodded along, but I saw a few rolling their eyes. We all knew this was damage control, not actual concern for student welfare. After the announcement, I headed back to my classroom but stopped dead when I saw Hartman in the hallway. He was standing near the main office, chatting with 2 assistant principals like nothing had happened yesterday. His hands moved casually as he talked, and he even laughed at something one of them said. The man whose classroom got destroyed by a student with a crowbar was acting like it was just another Tuesday. I ducked into my room before he saw me watching. During my planning period, I opened my laptop and typed an email to Principal Williams asking about counseling resources for teachers who witnessed the violence. I mentioned how several of us were pretty shaken up and could use professional support. Her reply came back 20 minutes later with a link to some generic wellness website and a reminder about maintaining professional boundaries during this sensitive time. The message was clear, without being stated directly. I deleted both emails and grabbed my things. That evening, I drove to the coffee shop on Oak Street where the janitor had asked to meet. He was already there in a back corner booth nursing a black coffee. I slid in across from him, and he immediately started talking quietly about what he'd seen over the years. 3 different students had violently snapped in Hartman's classroom during his 10 years working here. Each time the incidents got contained quickly, and the kids disappeared from the school within days. Nobody ever talked about what happened to them. He pulled out his phone and started showing me photos he'd taken of work orders from the maintenance office. Glass replacements dated from 2014, 2017, and 2019. Furniture repair invoices from the same years. Wall patches where things had been thrown or smashed. All the work orders came from Hartman's room, and they lined up perfectly with when certain honor roll students suddenly left our school. I took pictures of his photos with my own phone while he talked about how Hartman always acted the same afterward. Never any concern or reflection, just that same smirk. Thursday morning, I met with Christopher Fry at the union office downtown. He spent 2 hours going through my documentation, asking detailed questions about dates and witnesses. When he finished reading, he leaned back and confirmed I was within my rights to report concerns through proper channels. He wrote down a name and phone number on a piece of paper. Thomas Crawford worked at District Compliance and would handle reports like this. Christopher warned me to keep documenting everything and make copies stored in different places. Back at the school that afternoon, I wandered into the staff workroom where damage invoices were posted on the bulletin board. The district always posted major repair costs as some kind of transparency thing. I snapped photos of the itemized list showing $32,000 just for the antique library shelving. Another $8,000 for Hartman's classroom furniture and windows. The numbers were staggering for one student's breakdown. After the department meeting that day, Hannah Cook caught up with me in the parking lot. She'd been teaching here for 20 years and looked around nervously before speaking. She mentioned how Kane's older brother had gone through something similar 6 years ago in Hartman's class. The family tried to make noise about it, but got pressured into settling quietly. The brother ended up finishing high school through some alternative program on the base. She hurried to her car before I could ask more questions. Friday morning, I drove to the district office and filled out a public records request for all incident reports involving property damage in Hartman's classroom over the past decade. The clerk behind the desk took my form without any surprise on her face. She said it would take 5 to 7 business days to pull those records, and I'd get an email when they were ready. Her complete lack of reaction told me I probably wasn't the first person asking for this information. Monday afternoon, I got a call from Thomas Crawford at District Compliance. He acknowledged receiving my initial inquiry through Christopher Fry and wanted to schedule an intake interview. He emphasized that no formal allegations had been made at this point, just concerns being raised about patterns. We set up a meeting for Wednesday morning at the district office. He gave me a direct number and said to call if anything urgent came up before then. That evening, I went online and started downloading Hartman's course materials from the school website. Every teacher had to post their syllabi and major assignment rubrics for transparency. I saved everything to a flash drive, then started reading through his grading criteria. The language was harsh even for advanced placement courses. Terms like intellectual inadequacy and fundamental incompetence appeared multiple times. His rubric for essay writing included subjective categories worth major points like sophisticated thinking and elevated discourse with no clear definitions. The psychological manipulation was right there in black and white. Students could never know exactly what he wanted or how to succeed. Every assignment became a guessing game where he held all the power. I printed out the worst examples and highlighted the most damaging language. By midnight, I had a thick folder of evidence showing how Hartman used academic criticism as a weapon. The pattern was so clear when you looked at all the pieces together. Smart kids who challenged themselves by taking his class got systematically torn down until they either snapped or gave up. The district had to have known something was wrong with 3 violent incidents and who knows how many quiet victims. The next morning, during hallway duty between second and third period, Hartman walked right up to me while students were changing classes. He stood way too close and said we all needed to support each other through stressful times, his voice smooth but carrying this edge that made my skin crawl. His eyes stayed locked on mine for several seconds before he walked away, leaving no doubt this was a warning about my documentation efforts. After school that day, a girl from my 4th period class lingered by my desk until everyone else had left. She looked around nervously, then told me Hartman had spent months making fun of Kane's writing in front of the whole class. She said he'd read Kane's essays out loud using this mocking voice, pointing out every little mistake and calling his ideas childish. Kane had started the year confident and eager to participate, but by October he'd stopped raising his hand and barely spoke to anyone. The girl asked me not to use her name, but wanted someone to know what really happened in that classroom. I thanked her and wrote down everything she said after she left, adding it to my growing file. That weekend, I went to the school library and pulled out yearbooks from the past 15 years. I started flipping through the senior dedication pages where graduating students thank their favorite teachers. Every single teacher in our building appeared multiple times across those years except one. Hartman's name was completely absent from every yearbook I checked. Hundreds of students had chosen to thank the gym teacher, the janitors, even the cafeteria staff, but not a single one mentioned Hartman despite him teaching advanced classes full of college-bound kids. Monday morning, my phone rang during my prep period, and the caller ID showed the Air Force Base Hospital. Otto Hancock introduced himself as part of the team assessing Kane's situation and said he needed to ask about classroom dynamics at our school. He couldn't share specifics about Kane's condition, but wanted to know if I'd observed any concerning patterns with certain teachers. I chose my words carefully, telling him about the documentation I'd been gathering and the patterns I'd noticed over years of teaching next door to Hartman. Otto took notes and gave me his direct number in case anything else came up. After that call, I met Christopher Fry at the union office where we spent 3 hours drafting a formal protected complaint. We combined my documentation with the janitor's signed statement about the repair patterns and included the photos of damaged property invoices. Christopher helped me organize everything chronologically, highlighting the escalating nature of incidents in Hartman's classroom. We submitted the complaint to district compliance that afternoon with a formal request for investigation into potential patterns of psychological abuse. The very next day, Principal Williams called me into her office to inform me about new hallway supervision assignments. She said we needed to increase visible staff presence throughout the building and handed me a schedule that had me stationed in the hallway during my usual planning periods. The timing felt deliberate, like she was trying to keep me too busy to document anything else or meet with investigators. I took the assignment without arguing, but made note of the date and circumstances in my file. Wednesday morning, I drove to the district office for my formal intake interview with Thomas Crawford. He had a thick folder on his desk already and took detailed notes as I walked him through everything I'd observed over the years. He asked specific questions about dates, times, and witnesses, writing down every name I mentioned. Near the end of our 2-hour meeting, he mentioned that other staff members had started reaching out with similar concerns about Hartman's teaching methods. He couldn't share names, but said my complaint had given others the courage to come forward. Through proper channels at the district office, I requested copies of Hartman's written feedback on student papers from the past 3 years. The clerk said it would take time to pull academic records, but they were public documents I had a right to review. When the box of papers arrived a week later, I spent an entire Saturday reading through his comments. The cruelty jumped off every page. Instead of constructive criticism about writing technique or argument structure, Hartman had written things like, "Did you actually think this was intelligent?" And, "Your inability to form coherent thoughts is painful to witness." On one girl's personal essay about her grandmother's death, he'd written, "Melodramatic and intellectually vacant," in red ink across the title. These weren't teaching comments. They were attacks designed to hurt. I made copies of the worst examples and highlighted patterns where he'd targeted specific students repeatedly. The following Monday, the district sent out an email announcing they were bringing in Elsie Harper as an external investigator to review certain classroom management practices. They didn't mention Hartman by name, but everyone knew exactly what this was about. The email said Harper would be conducting interviews with staff and students over the coming weeks and emphasized that participation was voluntary but encouraged. That afternoon, Hannah Cook stopped by my classroom after the students had left. She closed the door behind her and said she'd been teaching here for 20 years and had seen too much. She agreed to speak with the investigators if they could protect her identity, since she still had 5 years until retirement. Hannah described watching Hartman reduce accomplished students to tears during class presentations, telling them their ideas were worthless in front of their peers. She'd tried reporting it years ago, but nothing had happened except Hartman making her life difficult for the rest of that school year. 2 days later, a thick envelope arrived at my classroom from the district office with the police reports I'd requested weeks earlier. The pages were heavily redacted with black bars covering most details, but I could still make out 4 separate incident numbers from Hartman's classroom dating back 10 years. Each report listed property damage ranging from broken windows to destroyed furniture, but the causes were completely blacked out. I spread them across my desk and took photos of the visible parts showing the pattern of destruction in that one specific room. The next morning's faculty meeting felt different the moment I walked in. Some teachers who usually sat near me moved to other tables, while a few others gave me small nods of support before looking away. Principal Williams kept glancing at me during her announcements about maintaining professional standards and avoiding speculation. The room felt split down the middle between people who wanted the truth exposed and those who just wanted everything to go back to normal. After the meeting, I found an email marked confidential in my inbox from a parent I didn't recognize. She explained her son had been in Hartman's class 3 years ago and had attempted to take his own life during winter break that year. She'd never connected it to the school until hearing about Kane's breakdown, but now the timing made terrible sense. Her son had gone from loving school to refusing to even drive past the building after that semester with Hartman. I printed the email and added it to my growing file of documentation. Thomas Crawford called that afternoon, asking for enrollment data from Hartman's advanced classes over the past 5 years. I spent hours pulling records from the school database, showing how his classes always started with 25 students in September, but dropped to 15 or less by January. The pattern was consistent every single year, with kids switching to regular classes, or even dropping the subject entirely. I compiled spreadsheets showing the enrollment drops compared to other advanced teachers whose classes stayed stable all year. The janitor knocked on my door after school with a manila folder in his hand. He'd typed up a formal statement about all the repairs he'd done in Hartman's room over the years, and included dates when he'd heard Hartman say things about needing to toughen up the soft kids. His hands shook a little as he handed it over, but he said watching Kane's breakdown made him realize he couldn't stay quiet anymore. I thanked him for his courage, and carefully filed his statement with the other evidence. 3 days later, Elsie Harper arrived for my interview, wearing a sharp suit and carrying a briefcase full of forms. She spent 2 full hours asking detailed questions about everything I'd observed over the years teaching next to Hartman. She wanted specific dates and times when I'd heard shouting through the walls, and asked me to describe the tone and volume of what I'd heard. She took notes on every pattern I described, from the way certain students would emerge from his room looking defeated, to how he'd target the same kids day after day. Her questions were thorough and professional, and for the first time I felt like someone was taking this seriously enough to actually do something about it. The next morning, Principal Williams sent out a staff email with the subject line, "Professional Conduct Reminder," that warned against unprofessional speculation and emphasized the importance of maintaining team cohesion during challenging times. The message was clear, even though Hartman wasn't mentioned by name. Anyone cooperating with the investigation was putting their job at risk. I printed that email too, and added it to my file as evidence of the pressure to stay silent. My phone started ringing with calls from local news stations wanting to interview me about the incident. Christopher had already warned me this might happen and advised me to decline everything to avoid compromising the investigation. I turned down 3 different reporters who promised to protect my identity if I'd just give them some background on what really happened. The story needed to stay focused on facts and evidence, not sensational media coverage that could give Hartman's lawyer ammunition to claim bias. Otto Hancock called from the base hospital with an update on Kane's condition. He couldn't share medical details, but said Kane was transitioning to outpatient treatment and would continue therapy while living at home. The family was fully cooperating with both the civilian and military investigations, and Kane was doing better with medication and counseling. It was the first good news I'd heard in weeks. The counseling office sent over their annual climate survey data, with one teacher's results highlighted in yellow. They couldn't name names for legal reasons, but one instructor consistently scored in the red zone for emotional safety, with comments from students describing fear, anxiety, and feelings of worthlessness after their class. The data went back 3 years and showed the same pattern every semester, with that one unnamed teacher, while every other teacher scored in the green or yellow zones. The evidence was piling up from every direction, and it all pointed to the same conclusion about Hartman's systematic abuse of students. 3 nights later, I sat in the packed auditorium for the emergency board meeting, watching parents fill every seat and line the walls. The first mom who grabbed the microphone demanded to know how a teacher could terrorize students for 10 years without anyone stopping him. Another dad stood up and started yelling about his daughter's panic attacks after taking Hartman's class last year. The board members sat there looking uncomfortable, while parents kept grabbing the mic and sharing stories about their kids coming home crying or suddenly refusing to do homework. Some parents defended the school, saying we couldn't coddle kids and needed high standards, but they got shouted down by others waiving medical bills from therapists. One mom pulled out a folder of her son's essays covered in red ink with comments like "pathetic attempt" and "intellectually bankrupt" written across them. The board president kept banging his gavel trying to restore order, but people were too angry to stop. I watched from the back row, taking notes on everything, while Principal Williams sat up front looking pale. The meeting went 2 hours over schedule, with parents demanding immediate action and threatening lawsuits if nothing changed. The next morning, I arrived at the school to find a substitute teacher standing outside Hartman's classroom, looking confused with a box of materials. She asked me where Mr. Hartman kept his lesson plans, because she'd been called in last minute with no instructions. I told her to check his desk drawer, while noticing how the hallway felt different without his voice booming through the walls. Students started arriving, and I watched their faces change when they saw the substitute instead of Hartman. Kids who normally walked past his door with their heads down actually stopped and stared. During passing period, I heard students talking excitedly about Hartman being gone and wondering if it was permanent. In my own classroom, kids were asking questions and participating more than usual, like some weight had lifted off the whole building. One girl who'd failed Hartman's class last semester actually smiled for the first time all year. The substitute came to find me at lunch, saying she couldn't understand Hartman's grading system because nothing made sense. She showed me his gradebook, where students had wildly different scores on identical assignments with no explanation for the differences. I suggested she start fresh and grade based on actual rubric standards, which made her laugh nervously. That evening, I opened my school email to find a message from an anonymous account with the subject line, "Thank you for speaking up." The sender described taking Hartman's class 5 years ago and needing 3 years of therapy to rebuild her confidence after he destroyed it. She wrote about dropping out of honors programs and giving up on college because she believed she was stupid after his constant attacks. She said she'd been following the news about Cain and felt grateful someone was finally exposing what Hartman did to students. Her therapist had diagnosed her with academic trauma and said Hartman's teaching methods were psychological abuse disguised as high standards. She ended by saying she hoped current students wouldn't suffer like she did. I printed the email and added it to my growing file of evidence. 2 days later, Hannah found me in the copy room and said Elsie Harper had scheduled her testimony for that afternoon. Her hands shook as she told me she'd written down specific incidents from the past 5 years, including dates and student names. She mentioned one boy who'd transferred schools mid-semester after Hartman humiliated him in front of the whole class for misunderstanding a writing prompt. Another girl had stopped eating lunch because Hartman would patrol the cafeteria, criticizing students' food choices and linking them to their academic performance. Hannah said she'd reported these incidents to administration, but got told Hartman just had high expectations. She looked scared but determined as she left for her interview with Elsie. That same afternoon, Christopher called me into his union office and closed the door behind us. He pulled out a folder and showed me copies of 2 other formal complaints filed by teachers in the past week. Both described similar patterns of verbal abuse and targeting specific students until they broke. One teacher had documented Hartman telling a student their parents must be disappointed to have such a failure for a child. The other complaint included a recording of Hartman screaming at a girl until she threw up from anxiety. Christopher said the union lawyer was building a case that the district had ignored clear warning signs for years. He told me to keep documenting everything and stay strong because things were about to get complicated. A week later, I got an email from the district announcing new interim policies effective immediately. They'd created an anonymous reporting system where students could file complaints without fear of retaliation. All teachers had to attend mandatory training on appropriate feedback methods and recognizing signs of student distress. The email emphasized maintaining high academic standards while ensuring emotional safety for all students. I noticed they'd also added a review process for any teacher with multiple complaints requiring administrative observation and intervention. These felt like small steps, but at least they were acknowledging the problem existed. Thomas Crawford called me the next day, asking if I'd help develop new guidelines for constructive criticism in academic settings. He said the district wanted input from teachers who understood the difference between challenging students and destroying them. We spent 3 hours drafting language about specific, actionable feedback focused on work, not personal attacks. I suggested requiring teachers to balance critical comments with recognition of student effort and progress. Thomas took detailed notes and said these guidelines would become official district policy next semester. He thanked me for my courage in coming forward and said my documentation had been crucial to the investigation. 2 weeks after that, Thomas sent another email with careful legal language about the investigation's progress. He wrote that they'd found credible evidence of concerning patterns requiring further action, which I knew meant they'd confirmed Hartman's abuse. He mentioned multiple independent sources corroborating systematic inappropriate conduct and clear violations of professional standards. The district would be taking appropriate remedial measures to ensure student safety and well-being going forward. Reading between the lines, I understood they had enough evidence to take serious action against Hartman. Meanwhile, more families kept contacting the district with their own stories about kids who'd mysteriously struggled only in Hartman's class. One mom discovered her straight-A daughter had been getting C's and D's from Hartman while excelling everywhere else. A dad realized his son's depression had started exactly when he'd entered Hartman's class and ended when he'd dropped it. Parents compared notes on social media, finding identical patterns of targeted harassment disguised as academic rigor. The scope of damage was becoming clear as family after family recognized their kids' struggles weren't isolated incidents, but part of Hartman's systematic abuse spanning his entire career. 3 weeks later, Elsie Harper submitted her preliminary report to the district office, and copies started circulating among key administrators. I got to see parts of it when Thomas Crawford called me in to review my contributions to the investigation. The report was over 60 pages documenting patterns of psychological manipulation, targeted harassment of high-achieving students, and administrative failures to address repeated warning signs. Elsie had interviewed 47 people, including current students, former students, teachers, support staff, and parents. She'd analyzed 10 years of grade distributions, showing clear statistical anomalies in Hartman's classes compared to other teachers. She'd reviewed complaint files that had been buried in various administrative offices across the district. The recommendations section called for immediate policy changes, including mandatory recording of all one-on-one teacher-student conferences, quarterly review of any teacher receiving multiple complaints, and creation of an independent ombudsman position for student advocacy. She also recommended individual accountability measures for administrators who'd ignored or suppressed complaints about Hartman over the years. The next morning, Hartman's attorney sent a formal letter to the district disputing every allegation and threatening legal action for defamation. The letter claimed Hartman was scapegoated for maintaining high academic standards in an era of grade inflation. It demanded immediate reinstatement and back pay plus damages for emotional distress. But Thomas Crawford told me privately that the district's legal team wasn't worried because the evidence was overwhelming. They had written complaints going back 8 years, testimony from dozens of witnesses, and clear documentation of harm to multiple students. The attorney was just going through the motions trying to negotiate the best exit package for his client. That afternoon, 3 students stopped by my classroom after school to thank me for speaking up. They said they'd been scared to come forward before, but knowing an adult finally listened made them feel safer. One girl told me she'd been having panic attacks before every English class with Hartman, and they'd stopped completely since he'd been removed. A boy mentioned his parents had been considering private school because of the stress, but now they were staying. The third student just kept saying thank you over and over while trying not to cry. Their gratitude hit me hard because it showed how much damage one teacher could do when nobody intervened. Otto Hancock called from the base hospital with an update on Kane's condition. He couldn't share specifics due to privacy laws, but said Kane was making steady progress in treatment. The family was fully engaged in his recovery, with both parents taking leave to support him. The treatment team was optimistic about his prognosis, though everyone understood the healing would take months or possibly years. Kane was responding well to therapy and medication, starting to process the trauma of Hartman's abuse, along with his own violent response to it. Otto mentioned Kane had expressed deep remorse for the destruction he'd caused and wanted to make amends when he was ready. Meanwhile, Principal Williams started scheduling individual meetings with teachers who'd been vocal about the Hartman situation. She called them check-ins, but everyone knew she was trying to identify who'd cooperated with the investigation. When my turn came, she spent 20 minutes asking vague questions about my concerns and whether I felt supported by administration. I kept my answers neutral and referred her to Christopher Fry at the union for any specific questions. Christopher had already warned me about potential retaliation and said the union was monitoring the situation closely. They'd filed a preemptive grievance to protect my teaching assignment and ensure I wouldn't face any suspicious schedule changes or negative evaluations. 2 days later, Principal Williams sent a school-wide email announcing her decision to take early retirement at the end of the school year. She wrote about wanting to spend more time with family and pursue personal interests after decades in education. But everyone could read between the lines that she was being held accountable for enabling Hartman's behavior through years of inaction. Teachers whispered about whether she was jumping before being pushed, or if the district had offered her a deal to leave quietly. Her announcement meant we'd have new leadership next year, which most staff saw as a positive change given how she'd handled this crisis. The district's negotiations with Hartman dragged on for another week before reaching a resolution. He agreed to surrender his teaching credentials permanently and never seek employment in education again. In exchange, the district would provide a neutral reference stating only his dates of employment and subjects taught. They'd also pay out his accumulated sick leave and vacation time, but no additional severance. It wasn't the public accountability many wanted, but it guaranteed he couldn't hurt students in other districts. His personnel file would be flagged to prevent any attempt to return to teaching through alternative certification programs. Hannah Cook and I started meeting weekly to develop support systems for teachers struggling with the culture of silence in schools. We created anonymous reporting mechanisms, peer mentoring programs, and clear guidelines for when and how to escalate concerns about colleague behavior. We presented our ideas to the union, which agreed to advocate for their implementation district-wide. Other teachers started joining our meetings, sharing their own experiences of witnessing misconduct, but feeling powerless to act. Together, we were slowly changing the culture that had protected people like Hartman for so long. The district announced the new principal 2 weeks before school ended, bringing in someone from outside with a reputation for putting student welfare above all else. She held her first staff meeting and talked about transparency, accountability, and creating an environment where everyone could thrive. She implemented an open-door policy and started eating lunch in the cafeteria with students instead of hiding in her office. Teachers noticed she actually listened during conversations instead of just waiting for her turn to talk. The atmosphere in the building started shifting as people realized genuine change was possible. On the last day of school, I found a letter in my mailbox from Kane's family, thanking everyone who'd finally exposed the pattern of abuse. They wrote about their older son's similar experience 6 years ago and their regret at accepting the district's silence agreement back then. They were pursuing separate civil action against Hartman personally, but wanted us to know they appreciated the institutional changes happening now. They hoped other students would be protected from what their sons had endured. 6 months passed, and the advanced placement sign-up sheet started filling up again with names I recognized from before the incident. Students who'd dropped Hartman's classes were coming back to take challenging courses with other teachers who actually knew how to push kids without breaking them. The hallways felt different too, with kids actually talking and laughing near the rebuilt classrooms instead of rushing past with their heads down. I watched enrollment numbers climb back to normal levels while new teachers implemented the feedback protocols we'd developed. The district held a small ceremony in the library where they gave the janitor a plaque for his years of careful documentation that helped expose the pattern. He stood there in his best work uniform, accepting the recognition while maintenance staff clapped and whistled from the back row. His filing system with all those repair invoices and dated photos had been the key evidence that showed this wasn't just one bad year, but a decade of systematic abuse. Thomas Crawford called me 2 weeks later, asking if I'd present at the district's Professional Development Day about recognizing warning signs of emotional abuse in educational settings. I spent 3 nights putting together a presentation using everything I'd learned about documentation, proper reporting channels, and how to support students who might be suffering in silence. Standing in front of 200 teachers from across the district, I walked them through the specific behaviors to watch for and the exact steps to take when they suspected a colleague was crossing lines. Thomas Crawford announced new oversight structures at that same meeting, including mandatory classroom observations by rotating administrators, anonymous student feedback systems reviewed quarterly, and clear consequences for any pattern of complaints. Every teacher would have their student evaluations reviewed by multiple administrators now, with automatic investigations triggered by consistent negative reports. The union had negotiated these changes into our contracts, making them permanent rather than just policy that could change with new leadership. I got a letter from Kane 8 months after everything happened, saying he'd finished his credits through the alternative program and was starting college in the fall. He wrote that he was majoring in psychology because he wanted to help other kids who'd been through similar trauma and didn't know how to process it. His handwriting was steady and clear, nothing like the shaky scrawl I'd seen on his essays before the breakdown. The state board sent official notification that Hartman's teaching license had been permanently revoked after reviewing all the evidence from our investigation, plus similar complaints from his previous district that surfaced during the proceedings. He'd never be able to teach anywhere in the country again, not even private schools or tutoring centers that required certification. Educational consultants started visiting our school to study the new policies and systems we'd implemented because word had spread about how we'd transformed from a place that protected abusers to one that actually put students first. Other districts sent teams to observe our anonymous reporting system, our peer support networks for teachers, and the oversight structures that prevented any single teacher from operating without accountability. A full year after Kane's breakdown, I walked into my newly renovated classroom, where fresh paint covered the walls and new furniture replaced everything that had been damaged in the aftermath. My advanced literature class was full again, with 22 students who actually participated in discussions instead of sitting silent and terrified. They challenged each other's ideas respectfully, asked hard questions about the texts we read, and submitted work that showed genuine engagement rather than desperate attempts to avoid criticism. The room next door where Hartman used to teach now belonged to a young teacher who kept her door open during lessons and whose students' laughter regularly drifted through the walls. All right, friends, that's a wrap for this story. I hope it left you smiling as much as it did me. Stick around. I've always got more heartwarming moments to share. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.